They came to her porch laughing, thinking she'd cry, but her hands didn't shake. The wind caught the hem of her dress, and in her eyes, the canyon shadows seemed to move. No one knew the widow's past, but the men who mocked her would soon learn. She wasn't praying for mercy, she was measuring the distance. The sun was low, a molten coin sinking behind the sandstone cliffs that ringed her land. The dry grass whispered in the wind, leaning all in one direction like it was trying to get away from what was coming. She stood on the porch boards, the wood worn smooth by years of boots that no longer walked there. The house behind her was plain and sun-bleached, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, nothing that would make a man ride out of his way. But the land was another matter. 40 acres of grass and water rights to a creek that never dried, even in August. Her name in town was Mrs. Lena Harper, though most just called her the Harper widow. She was the sort people forgot when she wasn't standing in front of them. She moved quiet, spoke little, and never set foot in the saloon. A woman in black who tended her chickens and mended her fence without asking for help. People assumed grief had shrunk her down to something small and harmless. People were often wrong. The wind lifted her dark hair from her neck and carried the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Far off, thunder rolled like a wagon over hollow boards. The storm wasn't here yet, but the air had that tight, waiting feel, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. She saw the dust plume before she heard the hoofbeats. 3 riders, dark against the sun, coming slow enough to be seen, fast enough to mean business. Her hand rested on the porch rail, fingers grazing the wood where the grain had risen in the heat. Beneath the sleeve of her plain dress, just above the wrist, a pale scar curved like a half-moon, old and faded, but deep enough to catch the light. At her hip, beneath the fold of her skirt, the handle of a knife rested in a sheath patterned with Apache beadwork, worn smooth by years of handling. The riders came into the yard without asking. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, a dusty duster flaring around him, a hat pulled low. His face was a patchwork of old brawls, jaw set in a way that told you he liked getting his way. The second was wiry, with sharp eyes that never stayed still, a coil of whip hanging loose in his hand. The third was thick through the chest and shoulders, the kind of man who could tear a fence post out of the ground just to see if he could. Their horses blew and pawed the ground, tails swishing at flies. The tall one swung a leg over and stepped down, boots thudding into the dirt. "Mrs. Harper," he drawled, like her name was a joke he'd already told himself twice. "Shame to trouble a lady, but we've come to collect what's owed. Your late husband was in our debt." She didn't move from the top step. "My husband's debts died with him." "That's the thing," he said, smiling without warmth. "We don't hold to that kind of thinking." He took a step closer, eyes sweeping the yard. "You've got land, cattle, water, all valuable. We figure you can settle his accounts easy enough." The wiry one, his mouth twisted into something between a grin and a sneer, let the whip uncoil and drag in the dust. "Could be we start with a barn. Might find something in there worth talking." The big man spat in the dirt, eyes fixed on her chickens scratching under the corral fence. "Could be we just take it all." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and the faint, metallic tang of coming rain. Lena's eyes flicked from one man to the other, her face unreadable. "You boys ride a long way today." "Far enough," the tall one said, stepping onto the first porch stair. "Why? You fixin' to offer a supper?" Her gaze drifted past them, toward the canyon mouth, where the red cliffs narrowed. "Storm's comin'. Roads'll be mud by nightfall. If you've got sense, you'll turn back now." The wiry one laughed, high and sharp. "Hear that, Clay? She's worried about us. Ain't that sweet?" Clay, so that was the tall one's name, kept climbing until he was a step below her. Up close, she could see the crust of dust on his coat, the split in his bottom lip, the yellowed whites of his eyes. He was a man used to pushing until things broke. "You gonna pay?" he asked. "No." He tilted his head. "You gonna beg?" Her eyes met his. "No." For a moment, the wind dropped and the yard went quiet except for the creak of saddle leather as the big man shifted his weight. Then the storm answered from far off, a long, Low rumble. Clay's smile widened just enough to show a chipped tooth. Then I guess we take what we came for. The wiry one stepped toward the barn, whip trailing, and the big one dismounted with a heavy thud. Lena didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the porch rail, her thumb pressing into the same groove she'd worn there over years of leaning. In her mind, she saw another place, another time. Firelight dancing off canyon walls, shadows moving quick as breath. She saw a dark-haired woman crouched low, a knife glinting in her hand, her bare feet silent on rock. She remembered the voice of the man who'd taught her, "Never let them see you coming." Clay took another step, close enough now that she could smell the trail dust and sweat on him. The wind rose again, lifting her skirt just enough to brush the beaded sheath at her hip. His eyes flicked down, caught the glint of the handle. She saw his pupils narrow. This story was whispered in saloons for years. The voice of the old narrator might have said, if someone were telling it by firelight. The day a quiet woman stood alone. The thunder cracked sharper this time, rolling over the yard like a promise. Lena didn't flinch. She was still measuring the distance. Clay Dorsey moved like a man who believed the ground was his to step on, slow and deliberate, shoulders loose, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that never lost their smirk. He had the air of someone who'd spent years bending people until they broke, savoring the sound. Hawk Murdoch was nothing but wire and sinew, a coil wound too tight, his gaze quick as a rattler's tongue. He toyed with the whip in his hand the way other men might spin a coin, the leather hissing against the dirt when he let it trail. Bo Tate brought up the rear, a mountain in a faded shirt, jaw heavy, eyes dull but watchful, the kind of brute who could crush you by accident or on purpose, and not bother to sort which it was. Clay stepped off the porch without taking his eyes off her, giving Hawk a flick of his chin toward the barn. "See what she's hiding." Hawk grinned, showing teeth too white for the rest of him. "Don't mind if I do." He slunk away, the whip dangling loose in one hand, boots whispering through the dust. Bo lingered near the corral, his gaze sweeping over the small herd, the chickens, the neatly stacked woodpile. He reached over the fence and poked a slow-moving hen with a thick finger until it squawked and fluttered away. He chuckled at the noise, like it was the best thing he'd heard all week. Inside the barn, Hawk's voice rang out. "Well, look at this. Feed stacked high, couple of saddles, a wagon wheel in good shape. She's sitting on more than she lets on, Clay." Clay turned slightly, calling back. "Check for tools. Shovels, axes. Things we can use." Hawk made a show of kicking something over, the sound of wood splintering sharp in the still air. Lena's jaw tightened, but she didn't move from her place at the porch. Her gaze followed the wiry man's shadow through the half-open barn door. Bo found the pump by the well and began working the handle, letting water gush into the trough until it spilled over. He drank deep from his cupped hands, then wiped his mouth on his sleeve, smearing dirt across his face. "Good water," he muttered. "Better than most in town." Clay heard it, his eyes sliding back to Lena. "Water's worth a lot, Mrs. Harper, especially in dry years. Could be a man might forget a debt if you shared your creek." She didn't answer. "You hear me?" he asked, taking a step closer, voice thickening. "Could be a man might not care your husband was a lying, cheating, low-down card sharp who." Her eyes snapped to his, sharp as a knife's edge. "Careful." Clay's grin widened. "Ah, there it is. A little fire. Thought you'd run out." From the barn came another crash, followed by Hawk's laugh. "Found an old trunk. Wanna bet it's full of love letters from her dear departed?" Lena's hand tightened on the porch rail until the wood creaked. In her mind, the noise from the barn faded, replaced by another sound, fire popping in the dark, the night air thick with smoke and dust. She saw painted faces lit in flashes of red and gold, the gleam of eyes beneath shadowed brows. A young woman crouched low, hair bound tight, moving between the glow and the black like a creature born to it. In her hand, a blade curved like the moon, its edge catching the firelight. She moved in silence, each step measured, each breath part of the dark. The memory slipped away as quickly as it came, leaving the taste of ash at the back of her throat. Hawk came striding back, a handful of papers in one hand, her late husband's ledger in the other. "You married a man who owed half the county, lady," he said, tossing the ledger onto the dirt at her feet. "Guess that makes you the one to pay up." Bo's voice rumbled low from the corral. Could burn her out, make her see reason. Clay tilted his head, considering. Might be easier than talking. Hawk twitched the whip, letting the end snap in the air. The sound cracked like lightning, echoing across the yard. Or maybe we just take a finger or two. Make it memorable. The storm was closer now, the air heavy, with that strange stillness before rain breaks. Lena could smell it, sharp and electric. She let the silence stretch until even the horses seemed to shift uneasily. "You boys have had your look," she said finally, voice low but carrying. "There's nothing here for you." Clay chuckled, shaking his head like she'd just told him a child's story. "You still don't get it. We're not a skin." Her gaze moved from Clay to Hawk to Bo, slow and deliberate. "Last chance," she said, each word distinct. "Get on your horses and ride out, before the storm." Hawk laughed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, confusion, maybe, or the edge of unease. Bo didn't laugh at all. He just shifted his weight, the boards of the corral fence groaning under him. Clay stepped closer again, his boots on the lowest porch stair. "And if we don't?" Her hand slid from the rail, fingers brushing the skirt where the beadwork sheath rested against her thigh. "Then you stay. And find out." The thunder answered for her, loud and sudden, rattling the barn door on its hinges. Hawk flinched, a barely there jerk of the shoulders. Clay didn't move, but his grin was tighter now, the easy swagger shading toward something harder. Bo straightened from the fence, eyes narrowing as if weighing just how much she meant it. Lena didn't look away. The distance between them was still hers to measure. Hawk moved first, just like she knew he would. Quick men couldn't stand still. It made their skin itch. He lunged for her arm, whip dangling useless at his side, fingers spread to clamp down on her wrist. She let him get close, let him believe her stillness was fear. Then her left foot slid back, the shift so small it might have been a breeze moving her skirt. His hand reached her, but before his fingers closed, her own hand snapped up, palm striking his knuckles. Her other hand twisted into his wrist, turning it in a direction wrists weren't meant to go. The sound Hawk made was sharp and ugly. The whip fell from his grip, landing with a dull slap against the porch boards. Her skirt swayed as her right hand dipped, drawing a blade from the folds of fabric, like a magician producing a dove. The handle was smooth, dark wood worn to fit her palm, the blade's edge clean enough to catch the dying sunlight in a thin, bright line. Hawk stumbled back, clutching his hand to his chest, eyes wide and wild. Clay cursed and came forward fast, his boots hammering the porch. He reached for her arm, but she stepped sideways, letting his momentum carry him past her. Her free hand pushed off the porch rail, swinging her weight in a tight arc that brought the knife flashing across his forearm. The cut wasn't deep, but it was enough to make him grunt and drop his hand away. Blood welled dark and quick against the dust on his skin. Bo bellowed something wordless and charged. She didn't meet him head-on. No one with sense would. Instead, she stepped down from the porch into the yard, her skirt catching on the hem of a water barrel. She shoved it hard with her hip, sending it rolling into Bo's shins. He stumbled forward, his bulk unbalanced. She slid sideways, letting him crash into the porch post, the wood shuddering under his weight. The three men regrouped, retreating several paces. The space between them was sudden and wide, the air alive with the ragged sound of their breathing and the far-off growl of thunder. Clay flexed his wounded arm, eyes fixed on her like he'd never seen her before. Hawk still cradled his twisted wrist, his mouth tight, breath hissing through his teeth. Bo rubbed at his leg, glaring as though she cheated him by not meeting his charge. The knife in her hand gleamed, steady as a heartbeat. Another was hidden in her left, the handle pressed against the inside of her palm, the blade angled along her forearm. For a heartbeat, the yard was silent except for the restless shift of the horses. In that pause, the smell of rain deepened, and her mind pulled her backward, years gone in the space of a breath. The canyon was colder at night, the wind curling down the red rock walls and carrying the voices of coyotes. Firelight flickered in a small camp, shadows sliding across the sandstone. A man sat cross-legged before her, his face half-shadowed by the flames. His hair was bound back, his cheekbones high, his eyes the color of flint. In his hands, he held a knife. Again, he said. Her fingers ached from the hours of practice, but she took the blade. The leather-wrapped handle was rough against her palm, the weight familiar now. She lunged at the figure-shaped post, the blade slicing the air. He caught her wrist before she made contact, twisting it until she had to choose between dropping the knife or having her bones splinter. "You strike like a hawk in the sun," he said. "Fast, but you let them see the shadow before the blow. Don't let them see. Be the wind. Be the dark between the stars." She nodded, breathing hard, the lessons carving themselves into her bones. Back in the yard, the rain smell was sharper, closer. The memory slipped away, leaving her with the feel of the knife in her palm, the stance drilled into her muscles, long before she wore this widow's dress. She had sworn never to stand like this again. Sworn it over a grave, swore it in the quiet hours when the blood on her hands had been her own as much as anyone's. That oath had held, through lean seasons and long winters. But now 3 men stood in her yard, and their greed stank as strong as gunpowder. Clay shifted his stance, the pain in his arm doing nothing to dull the challenge in his eyes. "You got some fight in you, lady," he said, voice low. "But fighting don't change numbers. We still outnumber you." She didn't answer. Didn't need to. The wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the hiss of the first raindrops striking the tin roof. Hawk spat into the dirt, his face twisted in fury. "She's nothing but a snake in skirts," he snarled. "Let's finish it." The storm cracked open above them, the sound so close it rattled the ground under their boots. She didn't flinch. Her knives caught the flash of lightning, and for a moment the yard was lit in stark white, her figure still and sharp against the dark. Clay hesitated. Bo's glare faltered. Hawk's shoulders tensed but didn't move forward. The pause was enough. She stepped forward once, twice, not rushing, just closing the space. Clay's jaw tightened, and with a muttered curse, he signaled with a jerk of his chin. They backed up, slow and grudging, to the edge of the yard. The retreat was temporary. She could see it in the way Clay's eyes lingered on her, in the way Hawk flexed his injured wrist like testing it for the next time. But for now, the distance was hers again. They fell back toward the corral, muttering low between themselves, 3 shapes moving through the copper light of late day. The horses shifted nervously, tails swishing, sensing something sharp in the air. Clay's voice carried just enough for her to catch the tone, half planning, half pride refusing to admit he'd been cut by a woman. Hawk paced like a caged thing, snapping his injured wrist back and forth as if pain could be shaken off. Bo leaned on the fence rail, massive arms folded, watching her with the heavy, patient look of a predator deciding whether to pounce. The wind had shifted again, tugging strands of her hair loose. She stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into the powder-dry dirt. Each step sent up small clouds that drifted and swirled in the slanting light. She carried one knife low and easy in her right hand, the second hidden against her forearm, the hilt buried in the sleeve of her dress. Clay straightened when she came into the yard, his smile returning in fragments. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But boldness without bullets ain't worth much out here." Her eyes stayed on his, steady, unreadable. "You've already seen how far bullets will get you." Hawk's laugh was thin and brittle. "A lucky twist and a scratch don't make you dangerous. You think you can stand against 3 armed men with a couple of kitchen knives?" She let the silence answer, the kind that draws blood from a man's patience. The dust was rising now, curling in little devils along the fence line. The sun had dipped low enough that the canyon walls glowed red behind her, and the shadows stretched long, cutting the yard into strips of light and dark. The smell of rain was still in the air, but it was faint now, as if the storm had paused on the horizon to watch what would happen next. She could feel the weight of memory pressing in, the past as vivid as the grit in her teeth. She had been 10 when the riders came, their faces streaked with ash and ochre, the sound of hooves shattering the stillness of the valley. The cabin burned fast. Her mother's hand shoved her toward the rocks, but she didn't make it far before she was yanked back into the smoke. The rest was pieces. The sound of shouting in a language she didn't know, the scent of horse sweat, the searing sting of a cut on her arm. When she woke, it was in a canyon camp. The people there were strangers, yet they fed her, wrapped her wound, and taught her to move, without sound. One man, tall, lean, eyes like winter, put a knife in her hand and showed her where to place her feet. She learned to listen to the wind, to see not just where a man was, but where he would be an instant later. She learned that a blade didn't have to kill to end a fight, and she learned to keep her past inside, folded small like a letter never sent. Now, standing in her own yard decades later, she felt the weight of those lessons in her bones. "This land is mine," she said, voice carrying across the dry air. "One step closer, and the desert will keep your bones." Bo's thick lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That a threat?" "It's a promise," she said. Clay shifted his weight, hand brushing against the worn leather of his gun belt. "You know how this ends. You can't throw a knife faster than I can pull a trigger." Her gaze flicked down, not to his hand, but to the faint twitch in his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, signs of a man already convincing himself he'd win. "You draw," she said evenly, "and you'd better hope you're right." The air between them tightened, every sound magnified. The creak of saddle leather, the restless stamp of a hoof, Hawk's breath coming a little too fast. Clay's fingers curled around the pistol grip. His smile was gone now. He looked at her like a man about to swat a fly. The sun slid lower, its edge touching the canyon rim. Shadows swallowed half the yard, and the dust caught the dying light, turning the space between them into a haze of gold and grit. "Last chance," she said. Clay's thumb slid over the hammer. His arm moved, slow for a heartbeat, then sudden, the pistol clearing the holster in one smooth pull. Clay's pistol cleared the holster, the barrel flashing in the last bite of sunlight, but she was already moving. Her right hand snapped up, the knife's flat catching the light, before it smacked hard against his wrist. The shot went wild, the crack of it splitting the air and sending the horses into a panicked shuffle. Before his finger could find the trigger again, her left hand flicked forward, the second knife spinning low and true. The blade bit into the ground at the toe of his boot, close enough that the leather puckered and split, pinning him in place. Clay froze, instinct locking his muscles as much as the shock did. Hawk came fast from her right, rage twisting his narrow face, his whip forgotten. He lunged, arms spread, thinking speed would win him the space. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, letting him rush into the void she left behind. Her palm caught his shoulder, redirecting him with the smallest push. His own momentum slammed him chest first into the corner post of the corral, the wood shuddering under the blow. He crumpled to one knee, breath wheezing between clenched teeth. The ground trembled under Bo's boots as he came from behind, a bear's growl in his throat. His shadow loomed over her, big enough to blot the last streak of orange sky. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She dropped into a low crouch, the knife in her right hand reversing in her grip. When his arm swung out to grab her, she slashed upward in a sharp, underhand arc, not deep enough to maim but enough to make him bellow. He bent forward on instinct, clutching his arm, and she rose with him, her elbow driving back into his ribs. The sound he made was low and guttural, his knees folding before he could think to keep them straight. Dust curled around them, kicked up by boots and blows, wrapping the fight in a haze that caught the fading light like smoke. She moved through it without hesitation, her breath steady, her step silent. Her strikes weren't the thrashing swings of desperation. They were the measured beats of a rhythm older than the rifles in the men's hands, a rhythm she'd learned in the canyon wind, the same patterns that marked the Apache war dances. Quick in the space between heartbeats, still when stillness was deadlier than motion. Clay yanked his foot free, the torn leather catching on the knife's hilt, and stumbled backward. Blood dripped from his arm where she'd cut him earlier, streaking the dust. Hawk staggered upright, clutching at his ribs, his face pale under the grime. Bo pushed to his feet slower, eyes hazy, his bolt now working against him as he tried to catch his breath. They looked at her, and something shifted. Not just fear, but a deeper recognition. This wasn't a farmer's widow defending her chickens. This was someone who'd seen the inside of more than one fight and walked away from each of them standing. The wind carried the smell of rain again, stronger now, the first fat drops tapping against the tin roof. She said nothing, just kept her knives ready, the line of her shoulders making it clear that if they stepped forward again, she wouldn't stop at scratches. Clay's lip curled, pride cutting deeper than any blade. "We'll be back," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had an hour ago. "Then bring more men," she replied. Bo glanced at Hawk at Clay, and then, without another word, they began to pull back. Hawk retrieved his whip with a jerky movement. Clay holstered his pistol without looking down, and Bo limped toward his horse. They mounted clumsily, dust clinging to their backs, and rode out the way they'd come, the storm swallowing them in the distance. She stood in the yard, watching until the dust settled, and the only sound was the soft hiss of rain on dry earth. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steady, as if she'd been mending fence instead of fending off 3 armed men. The creak of saddle leather behind her made her turn. A single rider approached from the north, his horse picking its way carefully through the ruts. The man in the saddle was broad to the chest, his badge dulled by years of dust and sunlight. "Evening, ma'am," the sheriff said, reining in at the fence. His eyes swept the yard, taking in the scattered prints, the fresh cuts in the dirt where knives had landed. "Saw 3 riders pass me at a good clip, all looking like they'd swallowed nails. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that?" She slipped the knives back into their hidden sheaths. "Just some men who lost their way." He gave a slow smile, not the kind meant for comfort. "Lost more than that, I reckon." His gaze held hers for a long moment, and then he said, "Been a long time since I seen you, Lena Blackbird." The name sat heavy in the air, sharp as the smell of wet dust. She didn't answer, but the stillness in her face spoke more than words. "Didn't figure you for the settling type," he went on, shifting in the saddle. "Last I heard, you vanished after the Red Mesa job. Folks thought you were dead." "Maybe I was," she said quietly. The sheriff studied her a moment longer, then nodded toward the horizon. "Storm's coming hard. You'll have the road to yourself tonight." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode off into the deepening rain. She stayed where she was, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the steady patter on the roof. The name he'd spoken lingered in her ears, stirring the echoes of another life. But the knives at her side were the same, and the land beneath her feet hadn't changed. Whatever the story said later, in saloons, in whispered boasts from men who claimed to have seen her, they'd start the same way. The day the quiet widow didn't beg. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the air washed clean and cool. The widow moved through her small ranch with the same measured pace she always had, her skirts brushing against wet grass, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the soft earth. She gathered eggs from the coop, checked the trough by the corral, and fixed the latch on the barn door where last night's scuffle had left it hanging loose. Nothing in her movements suggested urgency. Nothing hinted at what had happened in the yard just hours ago. The storm had tamped down the dust, but faint traces of boot prints still marked the ground, deep where men had lunged, shallow where they'd stumbled back. She stepped over them without pause, as if they were no more than animal tracks, the kind the wind would erase soon enough. Near midday, the sheriff rode in again. His horse's hooves made soft, wet thuds, the sound of a man arriving without haste. He dismounted at the fence, resting one arm on the top rail. "Word's gonna spread," he said. "Men like Clay Dorsey don't take kindly to being shamed. He'll tell it his way, but it'll travel faster than he can ride." She poured a bucket of water into the trough, the clear surface rippling outward in perfect circles. "Let them," she said. He studied her for a moment, perhaps looking for the flicker of fear, the tension in the shoulders, the signs he was used to seeing after gunmen rode through a person's life. But she gave him none. Her eyes stayed on the work in front of her, her voice steady and without heat. "Some stories," the sheriff said, "once they get big enough, they stop belonging to the truth. Folks make 'em into something else." She lifted her gaze then, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her mouth. "That's fine," she said. Truth's never been much protection. The sheriff nodded slowly, as though her words were something he'd have to think on later. He swung back into the saddle, gave a low whistle to his horse, and started for the road. "Take care, Lena," he said over his shoulder. "The desert's got a long memory." She watched him go, the sunlight catching the wet in his tracks before they faded into the distance. By nightfall, the lamps in the saloons would burn low, and voices would lower with them. A card game might pause when someone said her name. In one corner, a man would tell it plain, that 3 men came for her and left limping. In another, someone would claim she moved so fast the bullets never had a chance to catch her. They described the knives in different ways, long and silver, short and curved, carved with symbols from some tribe no one could name. Some would say she slit a man's throat in the time it took to blink. Others would insist she didn't kill anyone at all, that she only cut pride deep enough to bleed. And somewhere between the lies and the truth, the legend would grow. The quiet widow with a past that no one could pin down. The one who could kill faster than a rattlesnake strike, though whether she chose to was her own decision. She kept to her land. Days passed in the same way they had before. Fence posts mended, animals tended, the slow rhythm of survival in a place that gave nothing without work. But the air had shifted. The horizon felt different now, not in what it showed but in what it promised. Men who meant trouble might one day ride this way again, thinking they were harder than the desert itself. When that day came, she knew she would be ready. As the sun dipped low, bleeding into the horizon, she sat on the porch steps with her whetstone and her knife. The slow, even scrape of steel on stone carried out into the cooling air, the rhythm patient and unbroken. Shadows stretched long across the yard, the wind running light fingers over the grass, carrying the sound away into the open desert. Somewhere out there, the story was being told again, and with each telling, it wandered further from what had really happened. She didn't mind. Truth and legend both had their uses. The blade caught the last thread of sunlight, sharp and clean. She set it aside for a moment, looking toward the wide emptiness beyond her fence. The land was still, quiet, but the quiet never lasted forever.